The topic of today's lecture is host-guest chemistry. So in this lecture, I am going to explain whatever there is that you need to know for the host-guest chemistry. So first of all, moving towards what is host-guest chemistry? Well, host-guest chemistry is a branch of supramolecular chemistry in which a host molecule binds a so-called guest molecule or ion. So in this case, in case of host-guest chemistry, we have two molecules. One molecule is acting as a host while the other molecule is acting as a guest. So take this example here. The blue molecule is acting as a guest, whereas this gray molecule that is covering this blue molecule is acting as a host. Similarly, here this gray molecule is acting as a guest, and this blue molecule that is surrounding this gray molecule is the host. So these two components means these two molecules, this blue molecule and this gray molecule, interact by non-covalent forces, most commonly by hydrogen bond. So the type of bonding that is present between the host and the guest is a non-covalent interaction, and non-covalent interaction includes the ion-ion interaction, the ion dipole, the hydrogen bonding, and the London dispersion forces. All of these are the non-covalent forces that are present between the host and the guest molecule. So moving on towards a simple example, as you can see here that this is a host molecule and this is a guest molecule. The guest molecule will go inside this host molecule and it will form a host guest complex, and this host guest complex will have non-covalent interactions. So moving on towards the summary of supramolecular interactions. So what are different types of non-covalent interactions? Well, the different types of non-covalent interactions are the ion-ion interaction, the most strongest one, and that is from 200 to 300 kilojoule per mole. And the weaker interaction from ion-ion is the ion dipole interaction with the energy of 50 to 200 kilojoule per mole. Similarly, dipole-dipole, hydrogen bonding, cation pi, van der Waals, and hydrophobic interactions, all of these are the non-covalent interactions. And these non-covalent interactions can be present in the host-guest complex. So, when talking about supramolecular chemistry, this supramolecular chemistry can be split into two broad categories, the host guest chemistry and the self-assembly. Well, how can you differentiate between the host guest chemistry and self-assembly? In the case when we are talking about the host guest chemistry, the host molecule is larger whereas the guest molecule is smaller. When there is a difference between the size of host and guest molecule, then we will say that it is a host guest chemistry, whereas when there is no difference, then it is known as the self assembly. Okay, if one molecule is significantly larger than another and can wrap around it, then it is termed as host. Okay, the molecule that is larger and can wrap around another molecule, this molecule is known as host, and the smaller molecule is known as the guest. Okay, so here as you can see that this is a larger molecule and this larger molecule is wrapping around this potassium ion. Okay, so this potassium ion is a guest, whereas this larger molecule is a host. Similarly here, as you can see here that this larger molecule is a host and this potassium ion is a guest. Whereas we talk about self-assembly, in case of the molecular self-assembly, we have different smaller molecules. These smaller molecules bind by the covalent bonds. Okay, so a larger molecule is formed by the presence of covalent bond between the smaller molecules. So when the covalent bond is formed between smaller molecule, we have a larger molecule, and when different large molecules assemble together by non-covalent interaction, then this is known as the self-assembly. So this self-assembly is between different molecules through non-covalent interactions. Okay, so moving back, according to Donald Graham, the host component is defined as an organic molecule or ion whose binding sites converge in the complex. So Donald Graham's definition about the host is that the host is a molecule whose binding sites converge in a complex. So as you can see here that its binding site are converging towards the potassium. So this outer molecule is the host, whereas the guest molecule is that molecule whose binding sites diverge in the complex. So as you can see here that potassium is diverging towards each of the oxygen. So here the potassium is the guest. And what is a binding site? A binding site is a region of the host or the guest that is of the correct size, geometry, and chemical nature to interact with the other species. So moving on towards types. So when talking about host gas chemistry, we have three different types: the cations, the anions, and the neutral gas species in the solutions. So first of all, we will talk about different types of host. When talking about the host types, we have two different types of host. One is acyclic and the second one is the cyclic hosts. Okay, so first of all, talking about the acyclic hosts that are also known as the podents. So podents are linear or branching chain species with two or more sets of guest binding functional group positioned on the spacer unit in such a way to have a maximum guest affinity. So the acyclic host have a linear or branching chain species. So let's just say that this here is a acyclic host. As you can see from the structure, this is not forming a cyclic structure, so this is an acyclic host. This again is an acyclic host. This again is an acyclic host, and finally this again is an acyclic host. So these acyclic hosts have the linear or the branching chain, and they have the guest binding functional group placed on them. So as you can see here that this oxygen, 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 and oxygen, these are all the guest binding functional groups, and these are placed on the main chain of the acyclic host. Well, moving on towards the cyclic receptors have binding site position in a closed ring arrangement. So in case of the cyclic host, we will have a closed ring arrangement. So again, moving on towards this example, as you can see here that this is a closed ring arrangement and the potassium is present in this closed ring, and so this is the type of the cyclic host. Moving on towards the more pre-organized. So the cyclic hosts are more pre-organized and hence form more thermodynamically stable complex. So if someone asks you whether cyclic or acyclic host is more stable, then then you should answer that cyclic hosts are more stable. Why the cyclic hosts are more stable? Because the cyclic hosts are more pre-organized and hence form more thermodynamically stable complexes, and moreover there will be less conformational change required upon the binding, because in case of an acyclic host, when the guest bind to this acyclic host, then there will be some conformational changes, and these conformational changes will require some energy, whereas those conformational changes will be absent in case of the cyclic host. Now moving on towards the types of the host case complex, first of all we have the cation binding. In case of the cation binding, we have a cation that is present inside a host species. So you can take an example this, or you can take an example of potassium inside this molecule. I have given the names of these structures on the left hand side. So this first molecule is 18 ground 6 and the potassium ion is present in this 18 ground 6, and this molecule is dibenzo 18 ground 6, and again this here is a diaza 18 ground 6, and there it is a Lariant ether, and this here at the end is the podent pentaethylene glycol. So moving on towards the anion binding. In case of the anion binding, we will have an ion that will be binding towards a host species. So in this case, as you can see here, that these three bromide ions are binding towards this host, and again these three bromides are binding towards this host. Now, moving on towards the neutral receptors. In case of neutral receptors, there will be no charge on the host or the guest molecule. So, take this example here. When this molecule rearranges, it will form just like that. The circle is actually made up of the benzene rings, and as you can see here, that this structure is explained by this. The structure, this circular structure, this cylindrical structure is made up of this benzene ring, and above the benzene ring we have R groups, and below the benzene ring we have the OH groups. So when a gas species, this is the gas species that is composed of R and OH. As you can see here that this line is that of a gas species. So when this gas species comes inside this host species, what happens? We will have the R group that will be facing above with these, and the OH group will be facing below with these OH. So we have the non-polar groups that will be arranged according to the non-polars, and the polar group will be arranged with the polar groups. So that is the neutral receptors. And what type of interactions will be present? Again, there will be non-covalent interactions present between the host and the guest species. So that was all for today's video. If you have any question, you can ask me in the comments. Thank you and Allah Hafiz.